All right. Today we're going to talk about memory. Um, Memory is a huge topic, and we're not going to do justice to it in the time we have today. I just want to introduce you to some of the basic stuff. Some of you are interested in memory, you are interested in doing, studying memory for your final topic. So um, it's good for us to just look at some of the basics of it and give you some pointers and where you could find more material. Um, a lot of a lot of discussions on memory would talk about would start from this diagram. You may have seen it before if you had a memory course in the back uh, in the past. Um, and it's really with a lot of scientific topics, uh, what happens is that you want to divide and conquer, right? You try to divide the field into meaningful subparts that you could study, and then you could relate one to another later on. So it's important that to keep in mind that a lot of these divisions are just working assumptions, right? A lot of time you divide them, okay, saying there are two different types of this, two different types of that. And we talked about them before, like where we talked about, oh, this brain area does this, that brain area does that. Um, so it's important to keep that in mind. The the biggest division that people make in memory is between sensory short-term or working memory versus long-term memory. Now, sensory short-term or working memory is a memory that we have when we try to work, like manipulate things, and this is a memory that we kind of use as we interact, as we do, mental calculations. All of those things are the kind of memory that are short-term. Long-term memory is a memory that we have long-term of events, of knowledge, and everything. Um, this is a table from the book to dissociate between these two types of memory, at least. So, sensory memory is the memory that you have where you immediately see something or hear something and you have a memory of it. And this memory is extremely short term. So it's millisecond to seconds maximum, right? What is an example of this memory that you deal with every day? Like, what is an example of a very short term memory or working memory task that we do almost every day? I'll give you an example that I deal with is the double authentication, for example, right? So I have, like, for example, when you're trying to log into something and then you get a code, and let's say it's a 6-digit code. Initially, what you're supposed to do is to, well, I'm supposed to take this 6-digit code and then type it in, right? That form of memory is working memory. Like, it's a memory. You don't remember that 6-digit code that you used to log into your, new school account yesterday, right? That's not a memory that you may retain for a long time. This is a memory that is working. You just a memory that you need for the moment in order to um, basically type it in order to log in. So it's really last milliseconds to seconds. Uh, and a lot of time, let's what is the distinction between sensory and short term? Well, the distinction between sensory and short term is, let's say you are talking to someone and then they give you a pin or number. The initial thing that you hear from them, that's sensory, right? It's just sensory. It's not even short term at that point. When you look at an image and then later on you ask questions about it, that initial look that you have, it's all sensory. And it has high capacity because, so when you look at an image, you're getting a lot of information at once. And then you could answer questions, you could deliberate on it and answer questions about it. So if I show you an image, which is very complex, an outdoor image that is very complex, and then I ask you questions about, well, do you think this was taken in this season or that season, or how many should, so the initial memory that you have is very high capacity, and that's what this means, that you could actually answer a lot of questions about it. Now, when it goes to short-term memory, this is when you actually are able to repeat that, like the kind of things that you could like. I use the example of the pen. Let's say somebody tells you, let's say somebody calls you and say, okay, call me back at this number, right? Now you're looking and you hear the number, initially it's sensory memory, and then you try to write down that number, right? This distance between you hearing the number and until you write it down, you keep it in working memory. Does that make sense? So this is the working memory, that you're working with that data or you're working with that information that you're given until you could write it down, for example. This is one way that the book this is one way that the book relates these concepts. So in the example of the pin, when you initially hear the pin, you have a very good sensory memory of it, sensory register of it. You could repeat it right away to yourself and hold it in short-term memory. And then if it's your, credit or debit card pin or someone's phone number that you want to memorize, then through rehearsal, through doing it many, many times, then you would actually encode it in long-term memory. Yes.
What's the difference between sensation and sensory memory, or why we consider sensation and
So sensation is part of sensory memory, right? So you have sensory input, you sense that. The impact that sensory input has on your senses, that's sensory memory. So if I look at a world, or if I hear, for example, you're talking to your partner, for example. So, okay, they're saying something to you, and then you're not really paying attention, and they're like, you're not paying attention, and you're like, no, that's what you said, right? You could say immediately what they said to you without even having paid attention to them. So let's say you want to catch your partner not paying attention to you, you could say something and then wait 10 seconds and be like, you're not paying attention to me. And then they're not going to be able to tell you what you said 10 seconds ago. That's the, yeah, exactly.
That would not be what a couples therapist would suggest.
But I'm just saying, so that immediate thing that you could repeat right away, that's sensory memory without even having paid attention to it, because it is whatever happens in the environment, even if you're not attending to it, it is creating, it's causing neural activity in your senses. It's causing neural activity in your, auditory cortex, where it's creating a certain pattern. You're not paying attention to it, right? As we're sitting here, there are a lot of noises maybe in the environment that we're not paying attention to them, but they are impinging on our sensory modalities and creating sensory memory. Now, if you're attending to that sensory memory, then it enters your working memory. So attention is necessary for something to actually enter your short-term memory. So you hear a pin or you hear a phone number, and then when you hear the phone number, if you attend to it, then you could enter it to your short-term memory, and then you could repeat it to yourself to write it down for like a few seconds maybe. But it is very brittle, right? You could easily forget what the number, anything that happens between you hearing a phone number and writing it down, maybe that 2 seconds time that you have, it's going to cause you to lose that working memory. It has probably happened to a lot of you, right? Where you have a very short period of time to actually write it down to maintain it in working memory. But if you rehearse the same phone number over and over again, or a PIN number over and over again, it becomes part of your long-term memory. So when you have sensory memory, this is basically what your sensory modalities are experiencing from the world, and it's very short term. It has a high capacity in a sense that when you look at an image, you are processing it in parallel. So your sensory memory of that image is high capacity, a lot of things at once. A lot of time you're not consciously aware of all of that, right? We showed, for example, in the context of attention, where you could get a lot of input, but not be consciously aware of all the changes. Like the gorilla example is supposed to show you that you could have a very high capacity sensory input, but if you're not attending to it, you're not be consciously aware of that. Only things that you're attending to, you're consciously aware of it. Like we talked about inattentional blindness, for examples of that. The sensory memory decays very fast. So as I said, a few seconds later, you don't have any sensory register. Short-term memory, on the other hand, it's seconds, sometimes up to minutes. It's also, its capacity is very limited. And you experience this. Like when I talked about double authentication, if you're supposed to just look at that code and then type it in, what is the limit of the like how big should that code be for you to be able to do that? Like we all probably have our thresholds, but what is the number for you? Like how many digits can you actually do it with? 10? Yeah, but with pins, you actually go up to 10? That's impressive. Without looking back and forth, right? 6, right? Well, what would others say? 5, 6, maybe? 8? All right. So somewhere in that range, right? People have mapped it out to 7 plus minus 2 items, where you could actually look at a pin number that is like, or a, you know, a code that is 6, 7 digits, and kind of type it in without going back and forth. It's obviously very, so if I look at the pin and then you have me do another task and then supposed to type it in, I'm not going to be able to do that, right? There is nothing can come between the two, because that would be interference and I can't really maintain that work in memory. All right. So when we think of long-term memory, this is, yeah, it's best. So I'll briefly mention them. Later on, we'll talk about them more. Let's see, should I do that? So on the other hand, long-term memory is a memory that you have long-term, right? It could be a memory of what you ate for lunch today. It could be a memory of your, you know, childhood bedroom. All of those fall under the long-term memory category. These are memories that you could retain beyond few seconds or minutes. And it could be as far as 20 years, or it could be as, you know, few hours ago. Generally, they're divided to memories that could be declared, that could be spoken of. For example, facts of the world, or your, as I said, what you had for lunch. Or it could be non-declarative, which cannot be spoken of. This could be memories of maybe procedural, like you play a sport and you're very good at, you know, swinging a bat or something like that. Those are stuff that you cannot describe in words. They both have very high capacity. The non-declarative memories are not conscious, but the declarative ones are conscious. And you could actually interfere with them, and we'll talk about the ways that you could interfere with long-term memory. So before we move forward, I want to say, so memory, and I had a conversation earlier, memory could be very broad, right? You could say every system has a memory of what happened to it, right? So in a sense, you could say, well, if I use this example. So if I have a notebook and the notebook has some stains of, like, you know, tea or something like that, and there are some notes written in it, and once it fell on the floor and there's a scuff on the side of it, that notebook carries memory of all those events, right? It has traces of all those events. So broadly, you could define memory of anything that changes the system forever, in a way, right? So the next time that it is exposed to the same thing, it's going to behave differently because it has seen it before. So your body, for example, if you have an injury, your body has a memory of all those injuries, so you could re-aggravate it later, right? If you had not had that injury initially, then your body would react differently to this event. So any system, any complex system has traces of what it has experienced, and those experiences are going to impact its behavior. That's a very broad definition of memory. So there are evidence for why short-term STM is short for short-term memory, LTM is long-term memory. And you could imagine that there are a lot of evidence for the dissociation between them. You can imagine brain imaging studies that show different, brain areas being active while you're maintaining something in memory or while you're recalling really old memories. There are lesion studies that show that damages that cause short-term memory deficits are different from damages that cause long-term memory deficits. For example, you could, if somebody is trying to remember something in working memory, you could, if you use TMS and shock them, maybe they have a hard time maintaining that or something like that. There are also a lot of psychological evidence, experimental evidence for the difference between them. For example, duration, that you could maintain one of them short, but the other one you could recall in a very long amount, like long distance of time. The capacity is very different. The coding is very different in a sense that sensory and working is very surface, but maybe like meaning is mostly long term. Forgetting, short-term memory, you forget it fast, but then long-term memory you could, slow. So there are a lot of differences between the two, and that's why it's a big division, and it's a meaningful division in a lot of ways. But in some ways, it may not be the most meaningful division because, as I showed here, everything that enters long-term memory has gone, like, for example, long-term declarative memory has gone through short-term memory, right? It's not like you don't remember facts unless it has actually gone through your working memory at some point, right? At some point, you learned about it for the first time, and then later on, it becomes long-term memory. So planting a trace of a long-term memory, we're going to talk about it a little bit, has to go through the short-term memory. So the dissociation makes sense, but not this like absolute dissociation between the two. Okay, so the idea that working memory is limited, people have studied this in a lot of contexts. I'm going to show you one experiment in this context. So this is an experiment where you're looking at a bunch of squares with different colors, and then something changes. One of the squares changed colors. And then you're supposed to say which one it was. Okay, that's the experiment.
Okay, start.
Did something change color? Which one? Okay. Yeah. All right. Ready? Change color? No? Do you think it was easier or harder? All right. No change. All right. Ready? Change? Where was the change? Which one? Green to yellow. I don't know. Yes, you're right. Okay, you're right. Change? The pink one on the left side? Oh, wow, you're good at this. Okay, so, but you get the point. The point is that you could vary the number of image objects that are on the screen. Like you could do this with different objects. You could do this with different type of change, but you could also, get creative and have people look at this, then have them do a different task and then ask a question and see what kind of task would interfere with your working memory. Those sorts of things. Or people like to do, let's say, color task and then do have people do an arithmetic task and then add two things and then do a color task again. So you could get creative with this paradigm. But the idea is that as the set size, and we saw this term used before, as the number of object increases, the accuracy of people decreases. And you could see up to, let's say, 4 objects, people are pretty good. And then when you go to 8, it drops. And then at some point, even with 12 objects, people are not at chance level, as you can imagine, but it's around, let's say, 60% when you are at 12 objects. So people take it, again, there are different ways to study this, but the general point is that there is a limit to this number of objects that we could maintain, and that's what we call the capacity. And studies generally have found this 7 plus minus 2 works. Now, but what is the limitation of this, your question?
Processing speed part of working memory? But I don't get how that experiment is actually testing the working memory and not processing. Usually it's like they say 10 number and you can hear all of them and you repeat back it. I don't know that I even saw all the colors because it's so fast that it was on there.
Yes, so I think the idea is that when you look at an image like that, right, one strategy is to attend to one of them and then hope that was the one that changes. Now, another strategy is to try to maintain all 10 of them without attending to one of them, right? It's not really, it would be processing the speed if you actually had time within the time that it shows up to attend to all of them, then it would become about processing the speed. But as the whole thing comes up, you're supposed to maintain all of them in the memory and then the changes. So I think that's sort of, it kind of gets, this one gets a little bit into sensory memory, but I think you don't have enough time to process all of them regardless. So what is the limitation of saying, oh, there are only, let's say, 7 plus minus 2? Like, what do you see as limitation of this claim? What is an item in this case? A word or what? Or a number, like the pin example that I used earlier, an item was a number. But is that fair? Is that always true? Meaning that?
I think about like how to reach out by the relationship to different words.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, for example, again, there are a lot of issues associated with if it's in the same category. We'll talk about it. But in this case, there's a bigger issue that when you have, let's say I give you, I don't know, 300, 200, 600. Is that 9 numbers or is that 3 numbers? You see what I mean? You could use a lot of different chunking methods to actually, because the item is what you define the item to be. You don't have to have every individual digit be an item, but rather chunks of those digits could be an item. Like, I don't know, 900 called CVS, I don't know, something like that could help you remember a 9-digit number as only 3 pieces, right? So 2 words and 900 in the beginning. So that sort of makes it weird because if it's nonsensical words, then it's much harder, like the capacity is lower. But if it's meaning, if it's a set of words that have meanings to you, you could peg them or you could associate them to some things that you've experienced and then create a whole image of these 4 objects in there. And people, there are competitions of people memorizing this stuff. So they have like all sorts of strategies for memorizing things. Like, oh, you associate each number to a color and then you imagine a painting or some sort of methods for remembering a lot of stuff. What if the words are shorter or longer? What if they mean something to you, right? All of these things change the chunking and how many chunks there are. So it's so the claim is a little weird to make this claim that there was only these many items that you could remember. Yeah, does that make sense? So you mentioned some other issue. What if they're all part of the same category? What do you think a problem would be when you try to recall those? What's that?
Like words that sound the same will blend together, so you can't like pick one out from your working memory.
So let's say they're from the same category. Let's say it's, I don't know, bed, mattress, sheets, pillow. So they don't necessarily sound the same. But when you try to recall those things, there's another issue happens. What would be an issue, you think? Exactly, right? That's a great point, right? You could, when they're from the same category, you try to associate them semantically. And when you associate them semantically, that semantic association gonna then create a false memory of something that wasn't there. Because you're like, okay, these are all, sleep related stuff, and then your brain kind of interpolates them, and later on when you recall them, you're gonna recall objects that weren't there just because they're semantically associated. Yeah.
There's sometimes in tests, like it'd be a bunch of words and it'll be like, just repeat as many as you can.
Mhm.
Switch to like in the order that they were said, what's the different thing being tested there?
The order that they were there.
Yeah, so sometimes they'll give you 10 words and they'll be like, just repeat as many as you can. And then next they'll be like, okay, we're gonna do another 10, and I want you to repeat them in the order they were said.
I think so. There are, I guess, recency effects and primacy effects. So if you get a list of words, you're just generally more likely to remember the ones that came early and late. Again, in workplace, for example, if you're doing a job interview, it's good to be in the beginning batch or in the end batch. If you're in the middle, you get forgotten for that reason. So I don't know if what's the benefit of trying. So I guess they're testing maybe where in the brain. Again, sometimes you could test in the brain where the order information is stored, right? If you study something where that ordering information is stored. But yeah, it depends on what the goal is there. All right. So yeah, so be aware of this issue of chunking, right? You could exploit it also when you study for exams and stuff like that. I'm sure these kind of words where you take, different things and make a story, make a statement out of it to remember them. All right, so that was short-term working memory. On the other side, we have long-term memory. And the main division in long-term memory is declarative memory and non-declarative memory. Non-declarative memory would be the implicit stuff, and declarative one would be the explicit stuff. So what are explicit? Well, explicit, these are the type of knowledge and memories and experiences that you could actually recall and verbalize. You could actually speak of them. As I said, what you had for lunch, you could describe what you had for lunch. You could describe how your commute was coming here. It also involves facts about the world, that the sky is blue, or dogs are pets, and Ferraris are expensive, apparently. But the idea is that these are stuff that you could talk about, that you're conscious of them. Implicit memory, these cannot be verbally spoken. And these are, for example, classical conditioning, like fear conditioning. For example, you could do a lot of memory experiments, but they're done with, let's say, rats, or involve fear conditioning. They are in these metal cages, and then they walk around. Maybe they smell something, an odor that the experimenter is interested in testing, or as they hear a certain sound. And then as they hear the sound, they get shocked. Like you just plug the cage into electricity and they get shocked. And they will always remember that sound associated with the shock. So next time when you play the sound, they freeze. Right? They just in expectation of the shock. That's a form of, implicit memory, right? They just associate two things together, that this is bad or another thing is good. A bunch of conditioning, classical conditioning experiments like that, probably. Procedural learning for a new friend's accent. So what does that mean? That means like sometimes you make a new friend and they have a certain accent, and then over time, initially you may not understand everything they're saying, but after a few encounters, after a few hours of conversation, then you pick up on their accent. And picking up on someone's accent mean it's a form of procedural, like perceptual learning. It's a form of implicit memory. You cannot verbalize what happened in that process, but after a few hours of exposure, your sensory and modalities and your perception become tuned to that specific action, and you can understand what they're saying. It could be with the skills, right? A lot of us type with two hands, and we have a very good motor memory of how to type words. I type in a different language, and I don't even know what the keys associate with, but I could close my eyes and type it. Like, it's easier for me to type, without looking at the keyboard than to look at the keyboard, because I have this procedural like implicit memory of what that word is associated with. And sometimes, have you noticed that someone wants to remember a phone number? What they do is that you could close your eyes and like mimic the actions that you would make as you would type in the number, right? So the number is stored in a sequence of motor movement rather than in a form of explicit, accessible memory, right? Okay, so these are different types of implicit memory. A lot of time, implicit memories, you're not even aware that they're getting better. And that's the thing about not being conscious of them, right? If like people don't realize, like when you start a new skill, like you start a new sport, it takes a while for you to even realize you're getting better at it, right? Because it's so gradual and it's in your motor memory, and you can't quite describe what makes you hit the tennis ball better over time, but it's a form of implicit memory. So with declarative memory, this is the memory that, as I said, you could, you're consciously aware of it. People have mapped out these stages where you go through, right? The first stage is the encoding stage. You encode information in a perceptual system. Then you store that information, and then you could retrieve them at some point. Now, this is storage. The encoding part requires acquisition, which requires attention, and then consolidation. This consolidation is really the process where you put a trace down, right? So I talked about this a lot in the first module. Where are memories stored in the brain? What was that? Connections. They're stored in the connections between the units, between the cells, right? So a lot of, when I initially, like when we started the course, I said all our memories or our knowledge or our experience of the world, our trauma or whatever we have is stored in those weights. So when we experience the world, when we learn something, when we play a sport, right, those weights are changing. Our brains are plastic, and they change as we. So if you retain anything, it must be that the weights are changing. There's no other way, right? And that's the process of consolidation. And then the storage is that when they trace, then those traces get permanent. You store information, and then you could retrieve that. Now, this is a complex problem. Like, how is it that all of these information can be stored in connections? Well, these were all hypotheses, but now you could see systems that have a lot of knowledge stored in connections. What is an example system? What is it? What is an example system that has a lot of information stored in the connections between units? What's that? Yeah, but an example system outside, a biological system. ChatGPT, right? ChatGPT can answer your questions about everything because all the knowledge is stored in the connections, right? Theoretically, it was hard to believe 60, 70 years ago. How is it possible that knowledge could be stored in connections between units? But now we have, ChatGPT is just an example in a long 60-year research program. But but we have working models that can store pretty much the entire knowledge of the internet over the last like 25, 6, like 30 years that internet is a thing in the weights of a network, right? This is a network, it gets inputs, and then it can transform those inputs to other inputs to other inputs, and that those transformations happen through the weights. And then it could tell you what is the next possible word when you give it a sentence. And just by auto-regressively generating those words, it could give you information. So there is a good example of how this is possible. Yeah.
So like when traces of like my past are stored, like those connections must be like they have to like be able to be tampered with by like ensuing experiences, right? Because like it's not like memory is stored like as such. It's like always reconstructed in a way. So it's like there's like parts of the past that are like, you know, stored in these connections, but then like those connections are also like can be impacted or influenced by like ensuing experience then.
Yes, right. So there's this issue of how malleable should these traces be, and what is the right balance, right? So um, a lot of systems, when like let's say artificial systems, when you train the system on one task, you set the weights to do one task, for example, object recognition. Then you get the same network and train it on something else, they forget what the initial things, because you're changing the weights a lot. And then they're not able to do computations or transformation of those representations that we talked about across layers of, let's say, ventral pathway. They cannot recreate that anymore because they're not, they forgot all of that. Now, how is it that in the human brain, we are able to continually learn without forgetting the past events? That's a mystery. But there are some ideas around it, meaning that maybe there are a lot of replay happening in the brain, right? That you there are ideas that in sleep you could replay memory and try to consolidate them again and again. There are ideas that maybe brain is very smart with what connections to change and what connections not to change, depending on how important they are for the task that you've learned so far. But how would you know that? That's also another mystery. But this continual learning ability that we have is just a mystery at this point. I don't know. I don't have a good answer. No one has a good answer to that. Questions? All right. So far, I just wanted to give you an overview, the psychology overview of memory, so you know what these different keywords are and what they mean when we talk about, let's say, declarative, non-declarative, and other memories. We'll talk a little about neural mechanisms. Do we have time to take a break, or should we just go on, right? You should probably go on. So in general, people, as you would imagine, have mapped out what different brain areas could be mediating different types of memory. For example, they found that a lot of non-declarative memory, for example, procedural skills, right? These are the skills, as I was saying, when you play a sport, when you start learning playing a sport, you become very good. Like, for example, you become very good at swinging the bat, or you become very good at, playing dart. How does that happen? Well, if you go every day and just do this for 2 hours, I don't know how it's done. But if you do this for 2 hours, I guess you're very good and you become very good and consistent at this movement. And when you do that, well, where is this memory stored? Well, it must be traces stored in the motor area where these motor commands are generated. So you become very good at executing. And again, this movement, you could imagine, is an extremely complicated sequence of motor command for you to consistently make this movement. How to swing a golf club, similar story. And these would be stored in the motor cortex, but also in the cerebellum. Cerebellum is very involved in all sorts of unconscious memory traces. When people are born without a cerebellum, they kind of adapt, but a lot of them find out in adulthood, oh, the person is missing a whole cerebellum, but they're a little clunky with their movement, but they can adapt. Like motor cortex by itself can do this, but storing a lot of these traces, because what it really is, imagine in a robot, and the robot is making a sequence of movement, or an industrial, imagine an industrial robot that picks up a chip, moves around, puts it down. That's just a very precise sequence of motor commands to the joints of that robot, right? So this thing has to turn 30 degrees, this thing has to turn 20 degrees, this thing has to turn this much, right? These are just the small motors that are moving. And that sequence has to be stored somewhere. Well, in an industrial robot, those are programmed, but in a human brain, imagine that sequence has to be generated. So you have to learn how to generate that exact sequence. So when you start the movement, the rest of it just follows. Classical conditioning, like the fear memory example that I gave you, these are associative memories. Cerebellum is really involved in those. Habituation and sensitization, these are non-associative memories, but we're not going to get deeper into that. These are in the deeper brain areas. Priming, this is, I think we did an example of priming. This is about associating two things together where you see one thing, you expect the other thing to follow. Cortex is really involved in this. Brain stem, the habituation and stuff are in the brain stem. I didn't mention that. Now, episodic memory that we're going to talk about is more. This is a lot of it is happening, or hippocampus is involved in planting a lot of these episodic memories. Our ability to be able to recall memories from the past and also generate new declarative memories happens. A lot of it is hippocampus. Our family's vacation at the Grand Canyon is one of them. Also, the type of knowledge that we have about the world. For example, what is the capital of Maine? Where? No, isn't it Port? Oh, okay. Anyway, so that sort of knowledge is stored also. Hippocampus is also involved in that. All right. Before we move on, we're going to talk a lot more about hippocampus. But before we move on to that, I'm just going to mention a few things. For example, like we looked at amygdala. I think I briefly mentioned it. Some of you read a paper on amygdala for your second assignment. And it's very important for fear or aversive learning. So people without an amygdala or inactive amygdala are not able to learn what to avoid. You know, that's sort of aversive. Basal ganglia is important for reinforcement learning, and basal ganglia, so a lot of the dopaminergic neurons are in basal ganglia in an area called substantia nigra. And it's very involved in those sorts of reinforcement learning. Cerebellum that I mentioned in the back of the brain, this is very important for error-based predictive learning. So as I said, sequence of movement that you have to generate, and you know if you throw a dart and it's a little off, you try to control that. These sorts of correction of motor movement is involved in cerebellum. So people have mapped out different areas being involved in different things. Again, don't take any of this ever as like, oh, this is the only area that does this and doesn't do anything else, or no other areas are involved in it. These are just general involvement. So take it with a grain of salt. All right. So, okay. All right. We're gonna have to move a little faster, but okay, so we're going to talk more about hippocampus because this is an area. Does this not play? So hippocampus is in the medial temporal lobe. medial temporal lobe is in the pretty much the center of the brain. It's basically the cortex goes around it, and it's a much older brain, the set of brain areas. Also, it involves a little bit of the cortex. For example, if you have parahippocampal cortex here, that a lot of input to the hippocampus comes from the parahippocampal cortex. So it's in cortical area. Do you remember where we saw parahippocampal cortex? No one? Where did we see parahippocampal cortex? Do you remember the brain area PPA? Does that ring a bell? No? What is it? This was parahippocampal place area that we saw. Where did we see that? Yes. So in the context of object-based attention, we said, well, when people attend to the object or attend to the face or the house, when they attend to the house, you see increased activation in the parahippocampal place area. So when people are recognizing houses or locations in general, people believe that it happens in parahippocampal place area. And that gives a lot of inputs to the hippocampus. There are other areas that are involved, but hippocampus, unfortunately, this doesn't play around, but I wanted to show you where it's located. It's in the two sides of the brain. It looks like a seahorse, I think, and that's where the name comes from. Okay. Yes, shaped like the seahorse, gets inputs from the parahippocampal cortex, and it's really important for forming new long-term memories. But what people found out, and I'm going to talk about it, is that already formed long-term memories are actually stored in the cortex. The reason hippocampus became what is known to be very important for forming new memories was the context of a patient called HM. What HM had was seizures, and these seizures were determined to originate from the medial temporal lobe. So they removed them bilaterally, and that's a huge mistake, right? You don't want to remove anything from both sides of the brain. For this patient, they did that. So let's look at the brain here. Now you're all experts, right? So which view of the brain is this? Under, right? Where is the front? On the top is the front. We're looking at it from under the brain. So this is the brain stem. The cerebellums are in the back. Now, if I cut it where the A is, right? If I cut through it, you would see something like this. So we're looking at it from the front. So you're looking at me from the front, and then there is a cut here, and then so this part is removed, and you're looking at what's behind it, right? That's the view. Now, when you saw A, B, C, D, you could see that you get different cuts as you go deeper into the brain, so you could see where the hippocampus is. Now they removed his both sides, his hippocampus from the both sides, and again the seizures apparently stopped. But what happened is that he started having other problems. He started having memory issues, and he never formed declarative memories afterward. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that from that point on, he could not consolidate any declarative memories. He could not form any autobiographical memories beyond that point. He actually remembered autobiographical memories up to 2 years before the surgery. So he remembered who he was, like where he went to school, I don't know, maybe, and all those other stuff about his life and stuff like that up to 2 years before the surgery. But from that point on, he could not form any new memories. So you could see here, this is the case where the hippocampus are missing from the both sides. And then this is what an intact brain would look like with the hippocampus in place. So what happened was that he could still learn motor skills, right? He could still, if he repeated something, he would become better at it in terms of non-declarative memories. He could learn maybe piano lessons and play, piano and stuff like that. He also, as I said, knew some autobiographical details of his past life up to 2 years before the surgery. But what happened was that this transfer of that short-term memory to long-term memory, where you consolidate memories, were disrupted. Okay? There is a movie that was made, kind of show you what this is like. Do you remember what movie it was? Yes. Memento from Christopher Nolan, right? This was from what, like 20 years ago, I think. So the movie follows this character that could not form any new memories. And so he had very short-term memory, like up to, I don't know, was it 30 seconds or a minute? And then he would forget everything. And it's a very well-made movie, and I recommend you watch it if you haven't. But it was inspired by this idea of what would life be if you couldn't remember, if you couldn't form any new memories. Now, like, I had a course with someone, and she had worked with like this patient, and like this study was like, initially the surgery was done, I think, in the 50s, and then he became like a celebrity subject, like a lot of people made a career out of doing experiments on him and writing papers on it and whatnot. And one of the like the study they worked on was that, you could they would give him lunch, for example, like when you run out of ideas, this is one. They would give him lunch, and then they would come back an hour later, and then they would give him lunch again. He didn't remember that he had lunch an hour ago, right? Imagine having this patient, and that's the research idea that you come up with. But so the idea is that you would have short-term memory. You could discuss this stuff with him and stuff like that, and then you would leave the room and then come back, and he would not know that they had a discussion with you about that, right? So that's the idea. You live in the moment, and for a short amount of time, you could maintain conversations and whatnot normally, but you cannot really transfer that short-term knowledge into memory traces that would last a long time. A lot of it has to do not only with forming memories, but also with having a coherent memory of everything that happens, of consolidating. So let's say you talk to someone, and then you talk to them again 6 months later, like all of this gonna be part of the coherent memory of this person. And again, this is another mystery. How is it that the brain can so well integrate new memories about someone without losing the old ones? Like how is it that we maintain a consistent theory of mind about an individual? So the idea that he remembered his experience up to 2 years before the surgery tells you something, that those very long-term memories are not stored in the hippocampus anymore. Those are stored in the cortex, right? So hippocampus potentially does this, bringing all of this together and creating one coherent percept and connecting your current percept of this person to some old percept of them, so they can all become accessible. But then after it's all done, it would be stored back in the cortex for very long-term memories. So that's the suggestion here. Okay? Questions so far? So you could also study this in animals. So in this case, you have a monkey, and the task is, so you put this cross on something, and the monkey knows that whatever is under the cross is the food. Now, let's say you have a delayed non-match to sample task. This is a task where you give a sample, and then you have a delay, and the monkey is supposed to do what the previous sample, the opposite of the previous sample. Okay? So in this case, initially the food was under the cross. Now, because it's non-matched to sample, in the next trial, the food would be on the something that is not the cross. That's what it is. There are many versions of this task. For example, you could have images appear next to each other and you have match to sample. So if an image comes up, 2 seconds later, another image comes up. If it matches, then you get the reward. You have to say yes. That's a match to sample. If it doesn't match, you have to say no. You could have n back tasks. You could have, oh, match to sample 2 back tasks. So you have to say, does it match what I saw 2 steps ago? Or you could play around with it. There are lots of variations of this task for studying memory. But in this case, simple. So they see that this cross is associated with food. They go through a delay. They're supposed to know that what is not the cross is now associated with food. This requires them to have a memory of the previous trial across the delay. Now, what they did is that they lesioned the hippocampus. What they found out is that if you only lesion hippocampus and lesion it accurately, like in the case of HM, as I said, this was a long time ago. So they not only removed the hippocampus, they removed a lot of chunks around hippocampus too. So the extent of the lesion that they caused him was much more severe than just hippocampus. When you only lesion hippocampus, there is deficit, but the deficit is really visible when you remove a little bit around the hippocampus as well. So it's not just that hippocampus is involved in this process, it's that hippocampus and the surrounding areas are really important for this task. So if you go really, lesion a big part of it, you observe that severe form, which tells you something about the case of HM, which is that, well, at the time, they weren't very accurate with their lesioning or cutting out the stuff, but rather they removed a lot more than just the hippocampus. But in general, now, when they do surgeries on seizure patients, they're much more careful to remove as little as possible, obviously, but also not to remove anything bilateral. Because in the brain, you could always compensate for by the other side. You will always compensate by the other side of your brain, and then they're connected to each other. So if an area is really important, you want to maintain at least one side. Okay, so far, we've seen earlier on, I talked about the dissociation between short and long-term memory. Now, what is the evidence we see so far for dissociation between implicit and explicit memory? Well, when you damage the medial temporal lobe, you see impairment in explicit memory, in autobiographical memory. But you don't see damage in perceptual learning. Like a patient like HM can do a task and get better at it just by repeated motor movement. But if you have, let's say, damage to the visual cortex, you would have a lot of impaired perceptual memory, right? You could have impaired perceptual, like, I'm not talking about a study like that, but there are studies showing that if you damage parts of, motor cortex, then you would have a lot of impairment in your perceptual priming and or procedural memory, but your explicit memory is not damaged. You like damages to cortex in general, unless they're like extensive damage to the frontal area, do not damage your autobiographical memory and those sorts of very severely. Okay, this shows that there is dissociation between these two types of memories and where in the brain and what kind of brain networks mediate each other. All right. Let's see. I think we can get through it. So a very interesting thing about memory is the concept of false memories. And the idea is that it's surprisingly easy to plant false memories in people, right? It's like a lot of memories that we have, I'm sad to say, are false. Like you think something happened, but it never happened. And so an example of it is this, where they bring these subjects into a lab, right? What they do is that they take a picture of them, they take a real picture of them with a family member, for example, and then they place them in a hot air balloon. Then they tell them, they come to the lab and they're like, oh, remember, can you tell us about that time you went on a hot air balloon with your father? And they're like, I've never been on a hot air balloon. No, yeah, no, you've been, your father told us about it. It's like, are you serious? He said, yeah, you've been on hot air balloon. And they're like, no way. They're like, no, look at this picture. And then you show them this picture. And then they're like, and then the reaction is, well, you're like, oh yeah, you're right. Like they start just making up this whole story about how when they were like 6 years old, and you know, this is the age that is very suggestible, you know, like 5, 6 year old. Yeah, we went on a hot air balloon. I think it was in this town or something. And then all you need to do is a few believable pieces of information. Another thing that works very well is like telling people, for example, oh, remember you got lost in the mall when you were, let's say, 6 years old? And you're like, oh, I don't remember. You're like, no, it was like, this is specific, you know, their hometown mall, right? And then you're like, oh, it was this mall, it was in this part of town. And then they slowly start making up this whole story about getting lost, right? So you could easily, in this experiment, almost 50% of subjects started describing this experience that they had. So you could actually, with this suggestion, with just a suggestion, you can make them, you know, you basically plant a false memory in them. And then a year later, if you ask them, they don't even remember that at the time they said they didn't have this memory. It's going to become part of their long-term memory, and they're going to consolidate it. I mean, you ask them, they're like, oh yeah, this time and that and that. So this is very important in the context of, say, eyewitness testimony, right? You've seen a lot of cases with people describing events that happened, what, 30 years ago, right? 40 years ago. And they're like, yes, this person did this 40 years. I'm not going to mention details, but this person did this 30 years ago. A lot of those claims do not hold during cross-examination. And this is the reason. It could be a true memory. It could be that there is a core truth to it, but the details don't add up, right? Then they say, oh no, I was with this person. And I'm like, well, at this time we looked at it. It was not possible because they were not in the town at that time. So during cross-examination, because a lot of bits and pieces of those memories are false. Why? Because maybe you retold the memory to someone and they suggested something to you, and then that impacted your memory. And then you kind of consolidated that. And later on, when you tell this story 20 years ago, then it doesn't really hold up. Does that make sense? Right? This is really important in that context. A lot of time, eyewitness testimony has that issues, even for events that happened very recently, right? For example, you saw a robbery or you saw a car accident. That emotional state that you're in gonna make it very hard for you to consolidate whatever you're seeing the right way and be able to recall that. And you're very suggestible, right? That's why when you see an event happening, it's best not to talk to other people who saw it, because that's just going to contaminate your memory of it. And you're going to just pick up what they say as what actually happened. Okay, in this study, this was the case. But what they observed that was interesting is that when people were describing real memories and the one that were false and planted, they claimed that they saw real memory has more sensory and more widespread activation in the fMRI machine versus the stuff that were made up. I don't know how much you want to believe that, but there may be some truth to it where events that are real maybe activate a bigger network, that they have a more widespread network that are associated with that. Okay, those are false memories. So beware of when you think that something happened. Words, do I want to say?
Teach us how to insert false memories.
What's that?
You're not going to teach us how to implant false memories.
Implant false memory. I don't know. As long as if you're implanting something about a long time ago, it's easier, obviously, right? If you want to do that. Let's see. Okay. So during encoding, a lot of time, uh, different networks are involved when you're encoding something. Like, it's not surprising. When you process something, there's always lateralization in the brain and certain things. For example, people have found that words activate left frontal cortex during encoding. So when people are studying words in order to remember them, you see a lot more activation in the left frontal area. Nameable objects activate both left and right frontal cortex. You know, for example, when you're looking at this frog and then it's a nameable object, you see a certain pattern of activation. Faces activate primarily right frontal cortex. So in general, so right brain is more face processing, left brain, I think, is more like language processing or something like that. There is some lateralization. Again, it's not like, you may have heard these things before. It's not very, very strong. There are some degree of lateralization, and it's good to be aware of them, that there are studies looking at different lateralization of these encoding processes. It's not terribly important, so don't worry about it. I just have it here. Okay, so but this is a nice study so when I talked about false memory, this was an example of how memory could be faulty. But there are really cases that show, and we know from experience, how good our memory could be, like how well we could remember details of things and that they turn out to be true, right? So what is the capacity for that memory? So in this study, what they did is that they had participants, they showed them 2,500 objects, and they had to study them for 5.5 hours. That's a lot of objects, 2,500 objects. Now, afterwards, they were shown pair of objects, and they were asked which one of these were in the study set. Okay? And the type of objects they show in pairs look like this. They pair an object with another object that was completely novel. Like the whole category was novel. They never saw anything from, let's say, clock category. So they paired them with something that was completely novel category. They paired them with something that was a novel exemplar. So they studied this mirror, but now in the test set, it was paired with this mirror, and they were supposed to say which one was in this study set. They paired them with the same object, but in a different state. So in this case, the bread is deeper into the bread basket, and in this case, the bread is slightly outside, or the rotation is different, or it's the same fruit, but it's cut differently. So they've studied a lot of objects. Now you want to say, well, do they know what this is? How well do they remember these objects? You could put them in 3 different scenarios. Pair this object with something that is in a category that they never studied. This should be easier. Pair them with another object from the same category that they never studied, so that it's more difficult. Or pair them with the same object, but in a different state, and see if they can tell you that this was the one that they saw. Does that make sense? How these are 3 different stages of how good their memory could be. What they found out, naturally, that, well, surprisingly, they're very good at this task. People are very good at this task. Like when they're between 2 pairs of objects, they're very good at knowing, well, this is the one I saw, not that one. So there is a memory trace that gets activated, reactivated by seeing the object, that is very strong. Even in the case where it's the same object, but just because you change the configuration a little bit, you know that this wasn't the one that you saw. But there is a catch to this. What is the catch? What about this? You say, okay, awesome. Wow, their memory is so good. They're 87% accurate in knowing which one it is. But what is the catch? Motivation? No. What is the catch? When I say what is the catch, I mean, what is about this result is that that tells you that it may not be as good as you think it is.
Yes. There's we think always who are performing. they're good at performing these tasks. Maybe the tendency is memory is probably worse because with details, you know, be good at
It's that they have a 50% chance to get it right.
Yes, so 50% is the chance level. So that's one caveat, right? There's at least 50% chance. So 87 is not that great necessarily, but there's another so along that line, what would be the alternative way to test this? Yes, but let's say, what if I just showed this object and asked them whether it was in the study set? What would you expect the result of that to be? Was that? Yeah.
If you're looking at something testing, someone that will doing it, like in a psych test, they're gonna show you a room with objects, and then they're gonna take it away from it, they're gonna say what's changed.
Hmm.
And it's-
Yeah, so if it's a paradigm that you're saying, yes, it would have to do with shorter. Yeah. But let's say in this case, in this paradigm, they studied this for 5-6 hours. We take the images away. Now we have two options. One is to say, well, these are two objects, these two, bread and the basket, and then tell us which one you saw. Alternatively, I could tell you, just look at this image and tell me whether it was one of the 2,500 that you saw. Yeah. This recognition. So which one is recognition? Which one is recall? That's good. Yeah. So you're recognizing something as something you saw before. And it is very difficult to do that task, right? Because you're like, is this really the one I saw? I don't know. I remember seeing a bread and something. But when you're faced with the exact thing that you saw in this case, in all of these trials, one of them is the one that you saw, right? So are you actually recalling something, or what is the task you're actually doing here? Is it a test of memory? What is the actual task you're doing when you're two objects and you're deciding which one you saw before? You're just saying this one is more likely to be than that one, right? Meaning that it is a test of memory, but the caveat is that when you have two objects, you're just saying, well, I'm 40% confident it's this one, I'm 20% confident it's this one, so I'm going to go with the 40. So it could be that you're just comparing them, and then one of them matches your memory more, and then, so it's not really, you see what I mean? I just want you to know that when you see a study like that, think about what other ways it could have been tested, and whether those other ways would give you similar results. If we had people, if you just showed them one image and asked them, well, is this the one you saw? Just one. Or is this the one you saw, and then just show them multiple ones in a row, just one object, you may get a very different pattern. So just be mindful of that. So the claim of this study is that there is a massive storage to this long-term memory, right? If you can study these many images and be able to recall them and know that you saw them, even when the variation is small, there's a massive storage. Well, where is it stored? Do we maintain them? So there's always this level of granularity that you remember things that changes over time, right? If you study these images and you're tested an hour later, maybe yes. But what if you're tested 10 days later? What if you're tested, a year later, right? All of those things can impact how much you remember. Right? This is my last slide, so we made it. The slow loss of cognitive functions and memory beyond what is expected from normal aging is called dementia. There are different types of dementia. We all probably know a older family member that deals with dementia. And it's an important thing to study and understand. There is a massive, research program to treat these different sorts of dementia, especially Alzheimer. And the Alzheimer's disease or AD contributes to 60 to 70% of dementia cases. So it's and unfortunately, Alzheimer's research is one that is fraught with so much fraud and like bad results. I don't know if you caught, like there was this whole blow up last year of like this method that was published like, I don't know, 10 years ago, and a lot of people tried to replicate it and they weren't able, and it turned out it was fraudulent. But anyhow, it is characterized by extracellular deposition of aggregated certain sort of protein negatively impact the synapse formation and neuroplasticity, right? So for learning, you need plasticity. You need synapses to form, right? That's how cells connect to one another through these synapses that we talked about many weeks ago. And in order for you to learn, especially in hippocampus also, you need to create new cells, right? This is, and I'm going to talk about it later. But at this point, think about that you have to form new synapses. The cells have to connect to one another in order for you to form connections that would store the new knowledge or new experience or new episodic memory. The medial temporal lobe, not surprisingly, are the first to be affected in Alzheimer. And the pathology later extends to later temporal, parietal, and frontal neocortices. So it starts in the hippocampal area where this formation of new cells and new connections is slowed down. And then from there it spreads to the rest of the brain. Vascular dementia is a second type of dementia that is very common. This is caused by decreased oxygenation of neural tissue and cell death. Another thing that we need to form new memories in hippocampus. So in hippocampus, new cells are continually being born, right? The cells are split. It's one of the areas that has the highest, continual birth of new cells. And they can form new connections and they can, store new memories. And if that doesn't happen now, a lot of the studies shows that when you work out, when you have a healthy lifestyle, it's more likely that the hippocampus generates new cells versus when you have an unhealthy lifestyle. So working out is really important to maintain a good memory in the long term. So keep that in mind. And vascular dementia can affect multiple brain areas, resulting in diverse symptoms and can occur and co-occur with Alzheimer's disease. So in severe cases, you have both the lack of formation of new synapses. Also, you have the issue of cell death, that the cells are dying because of lack of oxygenation, and also new cells are not being born to replace them and to form new memories. Okay, so it's good to know about it. I just thought it would be, some of you may be interested in doing your paper on different deficits of memory. So I thought I would mention them so you know what they are and what generally causes them. Going back to the same thing that in the brain, and I want you to, internalize this, that in the brain, it's all about these connections and these activations. And memory is no different, right? Memory is also stored in these connections, and it's in the same framework that we talked about throughout the course, which is this framework of thinking about all these states as activations of these neurons, and these activations cause new connections and form new connections, and they can transform representations to do computation. No question? All right. Sorry, I thought you were raising. That's fine. Any questions? So, as I said, next week we'll have a hybrid class. I hope that many of you will come to the class. We may say a prayer together because of the Thanksgiving, but or I may read you a poem. Who knows? You don't want to miss that. But if you cannot